The Detroit Regional Chamber's MPC20 Conversations Respond and Rebuild digital series is provided in partnership with Detroit Public Television and presented by Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, with additional support from Accenture, Bank of America, Barton Malow, Comerica Bank, Consumers Energy, Delta Dental, Dow, DTE Energy, Enbridge Energy, Ford Motor Company, Huntington Bank, ITC, KPMG, the Kresge Foundation, Kroger, Michigan Economic Development Corporation, PNC Bank, Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation, Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans, the Skillman Foundation, and TCF Bank. And by these supporters. Support for Detroit Public TV's coverage is provided by DTE Energy Foundation and Masco.
Michigan is where skis become anti-fog face shields. Our favorite brews become hand sanitizer. And a bit of simple fabric becomes a life-saving face mask. Small businesses have come through for Michigan, and Consumers Energy is coming through for small businesses. Learn how we can support your small business at consumersenergy.com.
Welcome to MPC20 Conversations. This 13-week series of thought leadership transforms the spirit and the conversation of the annual Mackinac Policy Conference into a digital series that will focus on the most pressing issues confronting our society today. This new pandemic-forced format is made possible by the close and long-standing partnership between the Detroit Regional Chamber and Detroit Public Television, along with our scores of supporters, including Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan and Consumers Energy. Each week, the Detroit Regional Chamber and DPTV are fulfilling the mandate for statewide discussions regarding moving Michigan forward during this critical and unique time. In the coming weeks, nationally recognized speakers, along with Michigan leaders from business, government, and philanthropy, will engage in conversations on these screens that we would normally have on stage at the Grand Hotel. Today's discussion, By the Numbers, the Economic Cost of Inequity, will feature Dr. Courtney Cogburn, Associate Professor and Co-Director of Justice, Equity, and Technology Lab at Columbia University's School of Social Work. I'm also happy to add that Courtney has a Michigan connection with a PhD from Michigan. Following Courtney's remarks, I'll be joined by three outstanding Michigan-based leaders: Michigan's Lieutenant Governor, Garlin Gilchrist, First Independent Bank CEO, Kenneth Kelly, and the CEO of Consumers Energy, Patti Poppe, to expand on Courtney's thought leadership and discuss how business and government leaders can move racial justice and economic equity from something we just talk about to something we incorporate into our lives and into our businesses. Thank you so much for being with us. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation led by Professor Cogburn.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be with you to discuss a topic that's, I think, on the top of everyone's mind, and an important issue for us to be discussing and addressing, which is how to achieve racial justice and equity in our societies and in our organizations. Next slide. Before I jump into my remarks, I'd like to orient us a little bit and give some food for thought to consider as I make my remarks. Next slide. In particular, I'd like to pose 3 questions for us to consider. The first question, next slide, is whose safety and comfort are you prioritizing? When you're thinking about challenges related to having conversations about race and racism in your organizations, or decisions that you may need to make that may be difficult and complex, are you prioritizing the safety and comfort of some people over others? Are you prioritizing the comfort of those who may have difficulty making these sorts of transitions and having these types of conversations? Or are you thinking about the people in your organization who are experiencing the brunt end of racism in these spaces? Next slide. The second question that I'd like us to consider is why now? Why in this moment are we moving to action? And this is particularly relevant for those of you who may not have been here before. When we're thinking about the people who have been speaking to us and trying to get us to understand the significance of racism, were you resistant to the idea of this, or were you downplaying it in some way? This is not intended to be shaming in any way. It's intended to prompt you to consider what barriers were in place prior to this particular moment that may have prevented you from taking more substantive action in this particular space. Next slide. The third question is, why does race matter? So we're not only talking about diversity, we're not talking about equity generally, we're talking about race, racial equity, and racism. And this is a particular point of our discussion. And it's important to understand why we're emphasizing race as a distinct phenomenon in this conversation. And if you're really paying attention, we're really talking about anti-Black racism in particular, and understanding the distinction between these components, and in particular why race may be a distinct issue for us to talk about and address is an important thing for us to consider. Next slide. So the beginning of my remarks really think about the challenge of framing problems in an accurate way, and in particular thinking about the implications for the way that we frame these problems for the solutions that we may forward. How we frame a problem will fundamentally shape what we think we should be doing about that problem. And when it comes to racism, in my experience, people often misframe what racism is and how it functions in society and in our organizations. So I think this is an important first step before we get to the action, before we get to the doing. Next slide. So first, let's consider what is racism. Next slide. I posit that racism, we tend to frame racism as an individual level experience. We tend to frame it in terms of unconscious bias or individual acts of discrimination. What I would encourage us to consider is that racism is much more complex than what happens at an individual level, that we need to be thinking about the ways in which racism functions in our policies and systems and our cultural norms, and that these norms are historically grounded, and that they both simultaneously advantage and disadvantage groups of people within society and within our organizations. So thinking about racism as something that's structural and cultural in nature, and not something that's only a matter of exchanges between individuals. Next slide. So that brings us to the question then of anti-racism. So if we're framing racism as being systemic, cultural, and structural, anti-racism then assumes that racism is embedded throughout systems across domains, and thus can only be addressed through conscious and active engagement as a default in our intention setting, our analysis, and our action. Anti-racism assumes that if it is not anti-racist, it is racist, be that a policy or a practice. And regardless of your intention, if you aren't actively considering the ways in which you may be disadvantaging and advantaging people on the basis of race, you're likely to fall into a default that perpetuates those advantages and disadvantages. So anti-racism asks us to think consciously and critically about where those landmines might exist and attempting to avoid them at the outset rather than waiting for something to go wrong and then backtracking and trying to fix it. Next slide. There are a few different concepts that are also important to consider here. So one is identity versus positionality. When we think about identity, you're thinking about the ways in which you identify yourself, the aspects of your personal sense of self that are important to you. So your race, your gender, your hobbies may all be a part of your personal identification. When we're thinking about positionality, however, we're thinking about the ways in which you're perceived externally, the ways in which others around you in your environments may see you and thus treat you differently, and acknowledging that that may have implications for your lived experiences. Next slide. So when we think in particular about proximity to whiteness, this becomes important. So even if you wouldn't actively identify yourself as being white, I ask you to think about whiteness as existing on a spectrum. If we picture white and black as anchors on opposite ends of a spectrum, where do you land in relation to the white end of the spectrum as opposed to the black end of the spectrum? Where you fall along that spectrum can fundamentally change your lived experiences, regardless of how you personally identify yourself. It's important to note that this can also shift depending on context, where you fall on this spectrum at work, as opposed to where you fall on this spectrum among your family, where you fall on this spectrum in the United States, as opposed to where you fall on this spectrum in Brazil. The context can fundamentally change where you're landing on this spectrum and can thus shift your experiences accordingly. Next slide. When we're thinking about anti-Black racism, we're thinking particularly about racism that impacts people from the African diaspora. But we're also thinking about this notion of race and positionality existing on a spectrum. So the closer you are to Black on the spectrum, the more likely you are to start encounter the types of racism that we attach to anti-Blackness, regardless of whether you personally identify as Black or not. So the ways in which there's a global disdain for darker skin, the assumptions we make about people with darker skin, the beauty products that we use to try and lighten skin and put ourselves on a different place on this spectrum are, subtle but important indicators of how this manifests globally. Next slide. So what I'd like to do is to present to you 5 roadblocks and pathways to anti-racism and equity. So it's important to keep this orienting material in mind. Whose comfort and safety are you prioritizing? Why are we centering race? Why are we not just talking about diversity and equity in general? And thinking about this notion of whiteness and proximity to whiteness, as well as the distinction between identity and positionality. All of that becomes an important piece of framing these problems and then thinking about ways to address them effectively. So let's first consider roadblocks to anti-racism. Skip 2 slides, please. Number 1, avoiding race. So what I would posit is that colorblindness is not a solution to racism or racial inequity. It's actually a form of racism. It's a choice to ignore the ways in which race and racism are actively functioning in our societies. There's a tendency in diversity, equity, and inclusion work to lump all the problems of diversity together and to sort of put them under the same umbrella. It's important for us to not do that and to consider that the ways in which race is functioning in society and in our organizations is in many ways distinct from what we're observing in terms of physical ability or gender. So it's important for us to think about what about race in particular creates this tendency to want to avoid it and not name it and not talk about it. We certainly avoid using words like whiteness and racism, and we often sort of replace that with what I call racism light language. We use bias or microaggressions. So not only is it important for us to not avoid race, but to also use the language that actually describes what's happening. Again, going back to this notion of problem framing, if we're framing a problem of bias, when we're really talking about systems of racism, we'll attempt to address problems of bias and not address systems of racism. Next slide. The second issue is thinking about not understanding what racism is and how it functions. Next slide. Again, we tend to think about individual bias and unconscious bias, but again, what I'm asking you to consider is the definition of racism that I forwarded at the beginning of the talk. Next slide. So there's a tendency when we think about racism as an individual phenomenon to focus on, but I'm not racist. So as long as you don't think I'm racist, as long as you think that I'm a good person, next slide, then phew, our work is done. And as long as you are able to wear some badge of honor that says that you're not racist or that you have a low level of bias, that is the investment that many people make. Next slide. And what I argue is that we're less interested in whether you're racist or not, and there's an entire conversation we could have about whether that's even possible. What I would like people to focus on is anti-racism. Are you actively working against systems of racial oppression? Next slide. Focusing on whether you're racist or not, I would categorize with a lowercase n, although I'm a psychologist, I'm not attempting to diagnose people, but that's more narcissistic. That's more about you and how you identify and how you'd like to be seen. Anti-racism is more about behavior and policy. It's not a badge that someone gets to wear. It's not an identity. It is an orientation. It is an approach to engaging important social issues. Next slide. So instead of thinking about being racist or not, what I would encourage you to think about is, what is your relationship to racism, whiteness, and anti-Blackness? What actions am I taking to work against systemic racism? From my perspective, this is a much more meaningful orientation towards racism than your individual designation. Next slide. I like this quote from a colleague of mine who's also a psychologist, who says that rather than attempt to control expression of culturally constituted individual bias, a more effectual use of personal agency may be to reconstruct worlds that promote anti-racist tendencies. Next slide. Number 3, empathy is insufficient. Feeling bad for a group of people, or feeling like you understand how it's so terrible that they're experiencing racism, doesn't really do anything for the public good. That doesn't necessarily translate into behavior in the ways in which you're analyzing problems of race and racism in society. So it's important to shift from that point of view as well. Next slide. Another roadblock is focusing on individuals rather than systems. This is not only about our relationships, our interpersonal dynamics. Again, this is about understanding how policies and practices function at a macro level to create barriers to mobility, access, and power. So with this in mind, we really want to focus on structural competence as opposed to, or in addition to, really cultural competence. So structural competence speaks to your ability to understand in a complex and sophisticated way the ways in which these systems function to create barriers, as opposed to understanding the cultural differences and practices of various groups. Next slide. The last roadblock that I'll identify is that there is no neutral. There is no neutral within your organization. Your organizations exist within, contribute to, and benefit from the socio-political landscape. There's no magical barrier that we cross when we enter our buildings, although very few of us are doing that these days. We are part of the very systems that are being called for consideration in the global political movement that's happening around Black Lives Matter. This is not only a matter of police violence. The systems that are being identified and held to account through these protests are education, health, housing, employment systems, etc. We are all a part of this problem, and we thus all need to accept responsibility and accountability in the work that we're trying to achieve, in the progress we're trying to achieve. Next slide. So ultimately, what I would argue is that equity is not possible. Equity in any form is not possible without an anti-racist and anti-oppressive intention, analysis, and action. It has to exist at the outset of everything that we're doing. We have to anticipate, how could I potentially be disadvantaging or advantaging groups of people, particularly on the basis of race, by the choice that I'm making with this policy decision? Or how do existing policies perpetuate advantage or disadvantage in ways that may not have been intended, but that is the pattern that we're observing nonetheless. So what are the pathways to anti-racism? Next slide. So what I'd like to forward are 5 pathways that can help us move beyond some of these barriers. The first, next slide, the first pathway is framing before training. Often we skip a step and think about, what skills do I need to develop? What boxes do I need to check? What certification do all of my employees need to have in order to say that we did something? And what I would argue that those trainings are futile if you haven't actively helped people understand, again, the problem that we're trying to address. What is the training in service of? Why is the training necessary in the first place? Why are diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives needed in the first place? The roots of those problems and understanding that are a critical first step before we jump to training. Next slide. So one way that we approach this is through our virtual reality work. Helped to create, I led the creation of a digital immersive experience where you occupy the digital shoes of a Black male character named Michael Sterling as a child, an adolescent, and as an adult. And you're experiencing racism in different forms, in different contexts over the course of these 3 points of life from the perspective of Michael. And we're conducting several empirical studies to try and get a sense of what effect are we having on people when they go through an experience like this. Do we improve their structural competence? Do they start to understand the ways in which structural racism functions in society? So we're interested not only, again, in shifting empathy, but we're interested in shifting the ways in which people think and behave as a result of going through this experience. I would argue that this sort of shift is necessary before we get into more specific skills training. Next slide. The second is to pull your own receipts. If you don't think carefully about your organization and who you've been historically and who you are in a contemporary function as it relates to race and racism, your current and former employees may very well do it for you. And we've seen this happen in on very public forums where people are holding their organizations accountable for the statements that they're releasing related to Black Lives Matter. It's important to show your Black employees that you care and that you understand and are earnestly moving forward to address some of these issues. But this will require a deep, critical, personal reflection on who you are and who you've been as an organization. Next slide. The third is thinking carefully about your data. So what I often find is that people are invested in presenting data to the public that shows progress in the best light possible as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Another necessary step is to disaggregate your data by race and start to think carefully about how differences are emerging within your organization and not lumping all of the people of color together, but thinking about those groups separately and having an honest analysis of where you are as an organization in terms of those numbers. And to also think carefully about what data you're not analyzing and what data you don't have that you need in order to fully understand these issues. So next slide. Racial patterns in your employee data, I would argue, suggest a problem with your organization and not with your employees. If you find that Black people are consistently not being promoted within your organization, this might suggest a systemic issue rather than an issue with your Black employees. Next slide. The fourth is thinking about making mistakes as not being the problem. We'll all make mistakes. These are complicated issues. But what is more problematic is indifference and dismissal and arrogance and a lack of transparency and being disingenuous. Those are the problems that I see emerge when people are attempting to address issues of race and racism in their organizations. And I think that mistakes and fear of mistakes can be paralyzing. So accepting that you may make mistakes, but you're trying to move forward in an earnest and open way. The fifth pathway that I think is important, final slide, which is to not focus only on fixing problems. We have to address the problems of the past. We have to be honest about where we are and who we've been. But it's also important for us to reimagine futures, to really think about how we can better align our values with our behaviors and how we're actually manifesting as an organization. That's the fun part of this work. That's where optimism and hope lie, in reimagining who we can be and being a better version of ourselves, not just putting Band-Aids on long-standing existing problems. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Well, we're back, and thank you, Dr. Coburn, for a fantastic presentation, and I'm so glad that you're going to join us for a panel discussion building off of your fabulous and thought-provoking remarks. Just as a reminder, joining us, Patti Poppe, CEO of Consumers Energy, Kenneth Kelly, Chair and CEO of First Independence Bank, and the Lieutenant Governor of the great state of Michigan, Garlin Gilchrist. Welcome all, and we just had this great opportunity to listen to Professor Coburn, and I'm going to start with Patti Poppe from Consumers Energy. Patti, Consumers, Fortune 500 company, has been a national leader in the area of equity, and I would like to get your reaction to what Dr. Cogburn was talking about, and how maybe you at Consumers were able to incorporate her framing question, which is, whose comfort are you prioritizing when you have these discussions about equity?
Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Cogburn. It was a very thought-provoking talk. And your materials I've studied before, so it's great to have you live and in person with us here in Michigan. I think we have gone through quite a soul searching at our company for several years now about, I think, some of the points that Dr. Cogburn made about really reading your own receipts. Who are you really? What is your company? And we discovered something, just as an example, about a year ago in our hiring process. We would have 400 openings in some of our entry-level positions and have 1,000 applicants, but only 300 would qualify. And the majority of them would not represent a diverse population, particularly a very few number of Black people qualifying for the positions. And we really had to study our own receipts, as Dr. Cogburn said, and discovered we had this requirement, this one line in one job application that said should have experience operating heavy equipment. Now, who has experience operating heavy equipment? Well, I would suggest very few people from urban centers would have experience operating heavy equipment. I wouldn't have experience operating heavy equipment either, but it definitely biased unintentionally the selection process. And so it's investigations we've had to do like that to uncover unconscious bias in our processes, not bad people, bad process, not intentional, but needs to be addressed so that we can have equity. And so I guess I'd love to toss it back to Dr. Cogburn and just ask, as you work with companies and you talk to other business leaders, what would you tell a CEO that she should be looking for inside her own company? What kind of actions would an anti-racist take when evaluating her own company? How would you advise me? I'd love to get your input and advice.
Sure. I think the steps that your company took were fantastic, and it's exactly the direction you need to go. And I think what's important for us to understand about how racism functions is that it exists and functions without our intention, right? So we're thinking about, how have I disadvantaged a group of people? That line in your selection criteria created a disadvantage. So I think stepping back and thinking about, why do the numbers look this way? We often sort of default into an assumption. My apologies, I live in New York City. We often default into these assumptions that group they're just not cutting it and there's something wrong with the group. And what I suggest is that the organizations need to stop doing that and turn inward and say, why are we producing this pattern? What are we doing to produce this pattern, and what can we do about it? And your selection criteria is an important place to start. Are you really assessing the qualities that you actually need for people to be good at this job? If one of the criteria or some of the criteria you have are creating a disparity in the numbers that you're observing, can an adjustment be made? Is there some additional training programs that you might put in place that help you align the value of having a diverse workforce with who actually gets through the selection process? So I think those sorts of reflections are critical, and to think about it at every aspect of your selection process, your hiring process, your promotion processes, and also the ways in which your cultural climate is manifesting as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, both of you. I want to turn to Kenneth. Kenneth, you're the CEO of one of the leading financial institutions in the country, happens to be African American owned. How did Dr. Cogburn's approach mirror what you have done at First Independence Bank?
Thanks, Sandy, and thanks my panelists for serving on this. It's a very important topic. I would tell you that the professor hit it spot on in the way that she laid it out from a very academic perspective. But what I would do is try to root this in what I know most Americans would feel. It's not the head, but it's also the heart. And when you think about what Dr. King said, he said it best when he said, I'm not concerned about the people that I'm pushing against. I'm concerned about my friends who are silent. And what you when you look into her messaging and being the anti-racist was what she was really describing. And so one of the things we have to do is really be cognizant of our biases and how do we parlay those into our day-to-day interactions and figure out how to peel that back. Let me give you, some examples of that, Sandy. When you think about today, education, we allocate dollars to educate our kids based on the tax basis of the families who live in those areas. And so there's an implicit bias there for students who live in poor areas versus those who live in rich areas. And so when you get to experiences like Patti just talked about, which is, do you have an experience of working with a boat or do you have an experience of working with heavy equipment? The answer is no. And so you're precluding a whole class of people. The way I would sum it up also is to get to some of the data. It shows that McKinsey did a study that says 99% of African-American boys have a lower rate of upward mobility relative to their white counterparts. This shows also that 50% of African-Americans, even in the top income quintile, have a less than likelihood of staying in that quintile. So when you look at these constructs, we have to think about how do we contribute to those? And I'm gonna finish up this comment by saying two things. One, most African Americans understand the burden of all of these implicit biases. And I'm gonna put my friend, the Lieutenant Governor, on the spot. He wears the burden of being an African American in one of the most prestigious positions in this country. And if you ask him, I'm sure he would tell you privately, he does as an African American male. Most of my white friends would tell you, I don't feel the burden of the whole race of people based on the things and the actions that I take. Therefore, as the doctor stated in her comments, they don't feel the burden of being a racist because I'm not a racist. But the construct of those policies and procedures impact us all. And so that's how I would conclude. And so what we do at First Independence is to try to ensure we are purposefully driving towards equitable solutions. And it's the reason our institution was founded 50 years ago.
Thanks, Kenneth. I'm going to throw a question both to Professor Cogburn and our Lieutenant Governor, and that is the role of technology. You both have been really at the intersection of equity and technology in your careers in very different ways. Can both of you, and let's start with you, Lieutenant Governor, talk about how technology has both exacerbated kind of the more visible views of racism that we see in society, as well as a tool to mitigate against racism in our society. Lieutenant Governor?
Sandy, thank you for having me. And I want to thank my esteemed panelists, Patti, Kenneth, thank you for your leadership in our state, in your industries, and in our country. And thank you, Professor Coburn, for being really a beacon of information and inspiration in this space. And I'd like to actually start my answer by referring to the end of your presentation. Talk about the fact that we have a responsibility not only to solve problems, but reimagine futures. And that is, I think, what we all are charged with is putting in place, creating the condition for the future to be one where more people have a bigger role and a better understanding of their value and how they can find that future. And when it comes to technology, I'm reminded of something one of my best professors told me, Dr. Elliot Stalloway at the University of Michigan College of Engineering, told me that technology is actually pretty stupid. It actually does exactly what it's told to do, or exactly what it's designed to do. So that is why when you see technical solutions put forward as the solution to social problems in and of themselves, they actually end up only reflecting the bias of those who design or those who are implementing them. We have to be a lot more thoughtful than when we're talking about what the potential is for technical solutions to be able to solve these kinds of problems. It's a tool, however. So there may be ways that you can, for example, understand and identify and flag issues using technical tools. You can also use technology to deliver training experiences. We're trying to do things, for example, here in state government. As folks may be aware, we have called for, as part of our declaration of racism as a public health crisis in the state of Michigan, which allowed us to unlock the tools of state government to be able to address this problem. We've wanted to make sure now that all of our state employees, including us in the executive office, including the governor and myself, have gone through a pretty rigorous training on implicit bias as an understanding about how biases may creep in the decision-making processes when we're not aware. And so that is distributed, of course, in a technical way. We have tools that our departments are using to identify opportunities. We address those sorts of bias, things like that. But it is not the solution. Just like people are the ones who have been impacted and hurt by these biases and by structures that have been set up intentionally or unintentionally to exclude people based on race, gender, orientation, identity of any form. People need to be part of that solution as well. Technology to do it on its own.
Right. Lieutenant Governor, thank you. Dr. Cogburn, role of technology in exacerbating or helping to minimize racism in our society. Love your thoughts on this.
I agree with the Lieutenant Governor 100% that we often employ technologies in service of expedience, in service. We think that we're trying to achieve fairness when in fact the data that we've used to build those algorithms were biased from the very beginning and create some of the very same issues that we've been talking about. We see this with algorithms in healthcare, in our criminal justice system, et cetera. So we often have to think about, again, coming back to this point about being anti-racist at the outset, is thinking about how am I going to produce the same disadvantage or advantages for groups of people that I'm not intending to produce, and how might these technologies actually help me do that on steroids, right? So in some ways, these technologies perpetuate these inequalities faster and more efficiently than any individual human making the same choices and decisions could ever do. So it's important for us to be incredibly cautious when we're attempting to use technologies in these ways. As a professor in the School of Social Work who works in emerging technologies, I also value what the possibilities of these technologies, of these technologies. And I think an important piece of this is that we move beyond just following the lead of engineers and starting to incorporate people who study humanities, who work in communities, social workers who understand the complexities of human beings and human behavior in society, and get them more closely involved in the development and applications of these technologies. We've started a new minor at the School of Social Work, Emerging Technology, Media, and Society, to help social workers do just that. We're working closely with computer science engineers and social workers where they're working together on technological projects. I think that's the type of work we need to be doing to ensure that emerging technologies aren't getting us even deeper into these racial inequities that we're trying to address.
Kenneth, you had some thoughts on technology?
Certainly, Sandy. I think very simply, we all always should be thinking about the intent should equal the impact. And one example of that has come out of COVID-19 is the disparities we're seeing with who has access to broadband. We're seeing kids that have access, and then we're seeing kids that don't have access. Well, the reality of their education will be very different because of those outcomes. So one of the challenges I think we as leaders have is to think about how do we want to ensure that in a capitalistic society, yes, we have to take care of the capital side, but we also have to take care of some of the fundamentals of the value side. For instance, in rural America today, it is not necessarily capitalistic to go out and try to build broadband and fiber out there or wireless in a way that could reach all the kids in rural America. But the reality is there's a potential for the difference in learning between kids who live in rural areas versus those who are in metropolitan areas alone. So that's just one example where technology can be a continued differentiator and create more disparities. So I think as leaders and leaders of this chamber and leaders of this metropolitan area, we have to think about how do we bring solutions that create more equity so that we can increase the input and output of all of our citizens.
Right. Patti, I hate to break it to you, but you and I are the non-African Americans on this panel. I just wanted to put that out there. But I'm curious, in our previous conversation with Eugene Robinson, we talked about how hesitant so many people, particularly white people, are in having a conversation about racial justice because they're so afraid of saying the wrong thing. How did that, when you started those conversations as consumers, how did you overcome that hurdle in getting people to actually talk about their personal views in a safe way?
I can't suggest that we've got a lock on it. We've done our best to, we have a little phrase called ouch and educate, and we try and model it that if somebody does say something that is hurtful and maybe unintentional, maybe intentional, you stop the conversation with the ouch and then explain why that's hurtful. That's a mantra we've been working on, and it follows along our safety culture where we have a stop the job if something is unsafe. And so we've been leaning into that, but I don't think it's easy. And I think that we have to be really open-minded and sensitive to one another on both sides of that discussion to create a safe environment to have these challenging discussions that can really be game changers in the relationships that we have with one another and the environment within which we're all working. And so I think we just keep, like everyone else, working on it and trying to learn and acknowledging our vulnerability when we say, I might not be saying this right, or I'm going to try and express my feelings, and please tell me if I hurt yours in the process. I think is just takes a little bit of bravery on everyone's part, and a lot of kindness and a willingness to be open-minded and open-hearted in those discussions.
Right. Thank you. Dr. Cogburn, we only have a couple minutes left here, and I want to be able to end with you. And the question I want to end on is, you said that there is kind of an anchor between, blackness on one side of the anchor and whiteness on the other side of the anchor. What about those of us, such as myself, who are neither white or black? We don't fit in either one of those categories, and we often struggle in kind of, where do we fit? How do we involve in this conversation? So is it truly a linear black on one side, white on the other side, and a continuum between the two? Or is it more of a starburst where, different people with different backgrounds, including different religions, might have different offshoots off that continuum?
The spectrum that I'm talking about is specifically in the context of anti-Black racism and whiteness, and understanding your relationship to those particular phenomena. So not thinking about racism more broadly. So in the context of thinking about anti-Black racism, even someone who does not identify as Black or white still has a relationship to those constructs. You might be darker skinned, you may have certain hair texture, you may be Mexican but have very light white presenting skin. Those factors matter in terms of your positionality, how you walk through the world and how you're received in the world and in various spaces. So in the context of anti-Black racism, that's important for all of us to consider. In a broader conversation about racism, we don't think about this in a dichotomy of Black and white. We're thinking about the various ways in which disadvantage and advantage is emerging in society and in our organizations, and how that may be functioning differently for different groups of people. And when we move to that aspect of the conversation, this is not just a Black and white narrative. It's much more complex and nuanced than that. And it's also intersectional in a variety of ways. Black men and Black women aren't having necessarily the same experiences, and all of that is important for us to consider. So I hope the distinction between thinking about anti-Black racism, even if you are a person of color, but you may be on the white end of the spectrum in terms of how you present, you are likely having a very different experience than someone who is in the same ethnic group, but who has darker skin. And that's important for us to consider, just as it's important for us to consider all of these different experiences around race and racism, depending on your race or ethnicity.
Well, great. Well, listen, thank you, everyone. Dr. Cogburn, thank you so much for bringing your expertise to the Detroit Regional Chamber and the Mackinac Policy Conference. Patti, Poppe, Kenneth Kelly, Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist, thank you all so much for a fantastic conversation. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and we're going to end it from here, but with my sincere thanks to all of you. Have a great day. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
The Detroit Regional Chamber's MPC20 Conversations, Respond and Rebuild digital series is provided in partnership with Detroit Public Television and presented by Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, with additional support from Accenture, Bank of America, Barton Mallow, Comerica Bank, Consumers Energy, Delta Dental, Dow, DTE Energy, Enbridge Energy, Ford Motor Company, Huntington Bank, ITC, KPMG, the Kresge Foundation, Kroger, Michigan Economic Development Corporation, PNC Bank, Ralph C. Wilson Jr. Foundation, Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans, the Skillman Foundation, and TCF Bank. And by these supporters. Support for Detroit Public TV's coverage is provided by DTE Energy Foundation and Masco.